Hello again, everyone. This is just the final bonus lecture of the term that I thought I'd give you. So I'm going to be looking at media and culture, particularly looking at the notion of fandom, mainly kind of fandoms within the music industry, just to give you a bit of extra kind of culture studies. And this is a sort of academia that you may want to draw upon, maybe in second year for IJPC module, or maybe for your dissertation as well, just to give you a sense of the sort of things that you can consider looking at as well. So, in regards to fandoms, then, when did the notion of being a fan begin? Well, fan term stems from the word fanatic. You probably could work that out yourselves. So, first kind of recorded written instance of the word fanatic, 1533. And it was used kind of sporadically throughout those couple of centuries, mainly being linked to kind of religious fanaticism, being a fan of a religion. The term fan wasn't really used in any kind of cultural sense in regards to it being associated with an individual who likes a particular aspect of culture, whether it's kind of music or artwork and that sort of stuff. That started to change in the late 19th century, when the term fan started to be applied by the media towards sports enthusiasts, and also notably towards people who were fans of Sherlock Holmes. So this is where we started to see a kind of a link between the notion of fanaticism or fandom and a particular kind of cultural phenomenon. And one of the important things that kind of denotes the difference between a fan and just an average audience member is this notion of kind of having an emotional connection to the thing that somebody is a fan of. It's not just simply a case of watching a football match or watching a football team play. It's actually that you have an emotional investment in that cultural artifact. And so, as well as kind of the notion of fans, an individual, kind of a collective group of people, you also have the term fandom, which is kind of an area controlled by a personal rank, or it can be kind of seen as a state or a condition that someone is under. So kind of if you belong to a fandom, that can be kind of that notion of fandom itself is controlled by an individual person, and then also it can be seen as I said, being kind of belonging to a state or being in a condition of fandom. So moving on from kind of the late 19th century, and this notion of subcultures started to come about. So in the 1920s, academics and sociologists and anthropologists as well, they started looking at this concept of essentially kind of subcultures. And the subcultures basically they're basically seen as groups within society, various not necessarily demographics, but groups within society that are seen as kind of deviant, and maybe not deviant in the way that we tend to interpret the word deviant, but just kind of they were seen as kind of on the outskirts, on the fringes of society. And so this notion of subculture was proposed by what's known as the Chicago School in the 1920s, and it kind of throughout that various period for about the next 50 years, it started to kind of be applied to various other aspects of society. Then in the 1960s, you had the Birmingham School, which then started looking at kind of the notions of punk and that sort of subculture and that sort of deviance in the 60s going into, or the late 60s going into the 70s. And then Hebdige, he wrote this book called Subculture and the Meaning of Style, specifically looking at the notion of punk, and kind of see the image of representation of punk there in that image. And he basically said kind of subculture groups construct a specific style of dress, values and forms of listening that is meaningful to that particular subculture. So it was somewhat linking this notion of kind of subculture to the notion of identity, and that identity being expressed through kind of the way that people dress, the moral and philosophical values and political values that those people hold within that subculture, and also kind of the type of cultural artifacts that those subcultures engage with. In Hebdige's case, he was looking at kind of the people that engage with punk rock music. But even kind of back then, there wasn't really this notion of people studying fandoms specifically. But this changed in the 1990s, I think it was 1992, where Henry Jenkins, he wrote a book called Textual Poachers, where, this is Jenkins describing the book, where he says, Textual Poachers described a moment where fans were marginal to the operations of our culture, ridiculed in the media, shrouded with social stigma, pushed underground by legal threats, and often depicted as brainless and inarticulate. So within the book, Textual Poachers, Henry Jenkins, he looked at a number of different kind of fandoms, one of them being the Star Trek fandom, the Trekkie fandom. And, back then it's basically kind of these fandoms were seen as kind of nerds, misfits, geeks, I'll come on to obsessives in a bit. But basically they were just kind of oddballs in society, and they kind of all shared these fandoms. They also looked at fandoms in regards to kind of the Dungeons and Dragons, that sort of mythological side of culture as well. And so once Jenkins' book came out, people started to pay more attention to the notion of these specific fandoms and how they went about kind of expressing themselves, and also how they were actually portrayed in the media. Because as Jenkins wrote about, he basically saw that these groups were, he says, kind of marginalised by society. They weren't seen as normal in any real sense. So by the early 2000s, fandoms start to become more and more visible, start to become more and more mainstream. This is most evidently seen in kind of the rise of comic book fandoms. So you have large conventions such as Comic-Con in San Diego, and now in other places as well. Obviously, kind of in the mid-2000s, you had the rise of social media platforms, and platforms like YouTube, where fandoms could start kind of expressing themselves more readily. And just in general society, the notion of kind of being a fan of something started to become slightly less stigmatized in various ways. Now, there were, of course, and still are, various fandoms of particular franchises or books or movies or music that are still kind of put out onto the, or viewed as being on the fringes of norm society. But being a fan of something and being an obsessive fan of something is no longer seen as being abnormal. So fandoms and the kind of the individual fandoms became more identifiable and more distinguishable in the early to mid 2000s. And these fandoms, particularly within the music industry, not only were they just becoming more visible to the general public and to academia, they were of course becoming more visible to the people who the public were being fans of. The artists themselves were aware that they had these large fan bases that were kind of expressing themselves online and wanting to interact with them. And so you have artists trying to utilize these more visible fan bases by, this is an example on Spotify, by artists kind of giving them first access tickets to concerts that they may be holding, or giving special promotional offers if they're only going to release 500 vinyl copies of their latest single. And so artists started to particularly realize that these fan bases could be utilized in some way. Now, even kind of back in the 60s with Beatlemania, obviously the Beatles and their managers were aware of their fan bases as well, but particularly within the digital age, it was far more easier to manipulate, is not quite the right word, but certainly to engage with at a critical level, specifically with their fan bases. And so in the 2010s, there was kind of a real boom and growth of research into fandom. So the Fan Studies Network that was set up in 2012, and then you have kind of more and more book compendiums that kind of all gather various studies that have been done on fandoms across the world and across different types of culture. So fandoms in regards to cars, sports, music, cinema, all of those sorts of things. You see there on the slide kind of the Routledge Companion to Media Fandom, obviously with the Spock Star Trek hand reference on the front cover of it as well. So fan cultures, when it comes specifically to music artists, whether it's individuals and bands, they do have a number of kind of interesting features. I think two particularly noteworthy ones is in how the fandoms describe themselves, the nickname that they give to themselves. Oftentimes it is sometimes the artist that kind of promotes the particular name that they give to their fans. So Katy Perry actively called her fans Katy Cats, and that sort of stuck. But two common themes that you see, and I've listed just a number of different fandoms there for artists. But there's quite a heavy either militaristic theme, so referring to themselves as kind of the Kiss Army, Blue Army, Britney Army, Rihanna Navy, and also there is a theme of kind of animalistic traits. So you have Beyonce's Bayhive, you have the J-Cats, you've, as I already mentioned, the Katy Cats, and it is kind of a notable theme when you can look at various lists of fandoms, in fact, lists on Wikipedia or what have you, and that does tend to be a running theme throughout, that they tend to use this militaristic or animalistic language to describe themselves. And so fans and their groups, they are kind of particularly creative, and when fandoms really started coming to the forefront in the kind of 70s and 80s, you had this kind of almost cottage industry of what was known as fanzines, and this is essentially where fans of particular music genres and particular artists, they felt that, it says in the quote here by Savage, the established media could propagandise and comment, but they could not dramatise the new movement in a way that fired people's imagination. And so these fandoms essentially felt that the mainstream media, the establishment media, weren't kind of providing the sort of content that they wanted, and they felt that the mainstream media were being particularly dismissive of, punk rock culture and other kind of what would be deemed as kind of subcultures at the time. And so fans simply kind of started making their own magazines. There was, I believe the name of one of the most common ones was Sniffed Glue, Ripped and Torn with another particularly popular one as well, and these were sold at independent news agents. It was sold at the front door of concerts, and it was simply a way of kind of fans trying to kind of express themselves and getting their voice heard and having themselves feel seen, because they felt that the mainstream media either weren't covering them or were covering them in what the fans deemed as a kind of inappropriate or incorrect way. And so they started to create their own content. And then as this kind of as time went on, we went into kind of the digital age of the internet, and then we started to get more and more fan fiction. Now, fan fiction had always been written for decades and decades. There'd been fan fiction about kind of Sherlock, in the early part of the 20th century, but it certainly became more visible due to the rise of the internet. And so you had these new terms like fandom, rockfic, pop slash, and for those who don't know, the kind of slash fiction and kind of the notion of shipping two characters or musicians. A good example of this would be in the band One Direction, where people would write fan fiction where they would kind of imagine where two of the band members would be in a kind of a homoerotic relationship between one another, and that would be known as kind of shipping the two characters together. And this happens across not just in the music industry, but there are fan fictions about kind of Harry Potter and Ron Weasley getting it off with one another. You'll get it in Power Rangers fan fictions. There's a whole range of sometimes odd stuff out there, but there is a lot of this stuff going on out there. And so fan fiction is a quote by Hagen. Fan fiction concerns itself with the official narrative and often fills in the gaps or retells stories from a different perspective. And so this is just fan fiction serves a number of different purposes for different types of fans. Sometimes they just want to express themselves creatively. Sometimes they feel like the current cultural artifact, particularly if you're looking at kind of books and already existing fiction in cinema, that their particular imagination or their dream scenarios haven't been realised on page or on screen, and so fans will create their own narratives and stories to fill in their fantasy. But as I said, this also happens in the music industry as well, more so with kind of bands, but it does also happen with kind of individual artists as well. When it comes to artists, particularly the notion of kind of crossovers. Crossovers is where you can have Harry Potter having a conversation with the Power Rangers or whatever, kind of crossing over different fandoms and thereby kind of increasing the overall conversation that's happening between those two groups. Then, of course, another way that fans display their creativity and their emotional connection to their icon is through cosplay, and just simply through looking at the screen. Most of you would probably say, oh yeah, they dressed up like Katy Perry, because Katy Perry had a kind of a number of kind of particular styles and dresses that were very identifiable. I mean, obviously the notion of cosplay is far more heavily linked to video games and comic books these days, but it still also does go on within music fandoms as well. Another way in which fans express their creativity is through remixes, covers, and mashups. And if you just do a search for any artist on YouTube with remix or mashup or cover, you will find thousands and thousands of videos of they're not necessarily fans, but oftentimes they will be fans of those particular artists. And this is just kind of simply their way of, I mean, obviously it can vary from person to person, but their way of expressing their admiration for the original content that their artist created in the first place. And so there is this notion of kind of, well, why do fans do all of this stuff? What's the whole kind of purpose of it? And one of the purposes of fandoms and why fans kind of create all this content is that they want to try and connect with the artist themselves. And so there's a kind of a desire to kind of connect with them and have some sort of relationship with them. And previously, in the pre-digital age, these relationships were developed through fan letters, people just kind of handwriting notes, mailing it off, and occasionally you would get responses back. Oftentimes it would just be kind of a stock letter saying, "Oh, thank you very much for your support. I'm really glad you're a fan of mine, XYZ." There weren't that kind of a personal response. Very much like how when people have their 100th birthday, they get a card from the Queen. The Queen hasn't actually kind of handwritten it itself. It's just kind of a stock card that they send out these days. And that's what often was the case with fan letters. And it did vary from artist to artist. There were some artists that personally responded to every single letter they got, and it took them a hell of a lot of time to do so. But with the advent of digital media and social media in particular, this kind of opened up new ways for fans to interact with their artists, and also for artists to interact with their fans as well. And of course, one of the problems that this was that if you were writing a kind of a handwritten letter to your artist, to your musician that you're a fan of, there's a good chance that they might end up coming across your particular letter. However, if you're sending your favourite artist or band a tweet, those artists are getting thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of tweets every single day. And so one of the contentions that fans have to deal with in the digital age is, how do fans actually get noticed by their idols? And one of the other problems with kind of the use of social media to try and connect with artists, and this is one of the problems with social media in general, is the authenticity of the connections that are created across the internet. Neil Tennant of the Pet Shop Boys, he said, "My thing about social networks is that it's fundamentally insincere. It creates a fake intimacy, and we prefer not to be fake," which is why Pet Shop Boys don't use social media at all. And so there is this concept of kind of authenticity, that if you do somehow get a response from your kind of favourite artist, is that really an authentic response? Is that the same equivalent as having a face-to-face conversation with them? Now, for certain individuals and fans, they would value that maybe just as much as a face-to-face conversation, and for other people, not so much. So a quote from Beer here in 2008 said that celebrity use of social media can at least deliver a sense of intimacy, if not an sexual level of intimacy. So he says the long established while historically variable distance between star and interested enthusiast is eroded, although we can of course argue that this is illusionary. And so this then kind of begs the question of, well, if the fan thinks that they have a connection with their star, their preferred artist, as long as the fan thinks they have that connection, then is that good enough, regardless of whether there is any real connection there? As long as the fan has that perception and it makes them kind of happy to have that perceived perception of a connection, then is that good enough? That is certainly something that is up for debate and could be done on a case-by-case basis. This is a study looking at music fans, published in The Independent. It said an online survey of music fans found that a retweet is just as appealing to Twitter users as an autograph. Went on to say, Claudia, 46-year-old Duran Duran fan, said, I think I possibly prefer the connection on Twitter to actually seeing them in the flesh. When they're at the concert, there are loads of girls, but on Twitter, if you get a tweet, it's going to me, and they are answering a question I have asked them, so it's more personal. And so you know that, if you're just in a kind of one in a crowd of 1,000 people at a concert, you're not really getting the undivided attention of your particular kind of preferred artist or star. Whereas if you get a direct response on Twitter or a retweet from them, then you know that they have personally kind of seen kind of your question or your comment, and they've personally kind of interacted with you in some way. It may have only kind of happened on the internet, but that is at least more of a personal connection to some people. Now again, this is kind of purely on an individual case-by-case basis. I'm sure there are other Duran Duran fans that would actually prefer to see them in the flesh rather than just get a retweet from them, but there we go. Now, an interesting case in regards to an artist's relationship with their fans is Lady Gaga, and she has a very close and authentic relationship with her fans. These are just some comments that she's made over the last couple of years, or actually over a decade ago, these comments, but she's had said similar things recently as well. So Gaga said in an interview with CNN, I'm interested in helping my fans to love who they are and helping them to reject prejudice and reject those things that they're taught from society to not like in themselves, describing her relationship with her fan base as a massive group of misfits joining together to liberate themselves. Then on Twitter she said, haven't left the studio, each song I write I feel closer to you, miss you little monsters, little inspirations. Again, another tweet, I don't know what I did to deserve the gift of you and all of my fans, but God made you little monsters, very special, you are my heart. And so Gaga, she kind of actively does engage with her fans quite heavily on social media. She speaks out, and she's seen as having an authentic voice on Twitter as well. And the notion of authenticity is seen as being especially important when it comes between the relationship of an artist and their fans. And so this is a quote from a study done by Lucy Bennett, and this is a quote that says, I feel close to her as a fan because I feel like she is very involved in using the internet to communicate with her fans. I think it's obvious when reading her posts that she writes them herself. I like that she uses her social media in the same way that me and my friends use our Facebook, Twitter accounts. Most of the time she is posting things that are personal and are specifically written towards her fans. I think that is one of the most powerful dynamics of her career. And again, just this notion of authenticity, it's clearly her writing it, it's not her managers. She's using fairly kind of colloquial language. She speaks on Twitter and on Facebook as she would speak in real life, in the flesh. And so fans feel a greater degree of closeness and authenticity to Lady Gaga than fans of other artists might, when it might just be their managers that are just using Twitter to tweet out their latest tour dates or what have you. So another important aspect when it comes to looking at the studies of fandom is how the media represents fandoms. As I said kind of earlier, back in the kind of 70s and 80s, particularly music fans felt that they were being underrepresented and poorly represented by the media. And this largely kind of stemmed from the fact that the media presented fans in mainly two categories. So this quote from Jolly Jensen says, the literature on fandom is haunted by images of deviance, again going back to that notion of subcultures, The fan is consistently characterized, referencing the term's origins, as a potential fanatic. This means that fandom is seen as excessive, bordering on deranged behavior. And so you get these two types of fans commonly perceived in the media. You have the hysterical crowd, and then you have the obsessed loner. Let's go for kind of two famous examples of these. So with the hysterical crowd, I'm sure most of you remember, some of you maybe felt that you were part of this hysterical crowd. Maybe not as Beatlemania, because none of you are that old, but Beatlemania, a lot of the time the fandoms were kind of seen as being absolutely kind of out of their minds. Women were kind of essentially kind of throwing themselves almost off balconies to just get a glimpse of seeing the Beatles, and the way the media kind of portrayed these fans was that they were simply insane and they're over emotional, and it happened to be the case that the kind of Beatlemania fans by and large tended to be young women, and it kind of fed into that particular kind of stereotypical narrative of women, they're over emotional, they can't control their emotions, all of that sort of stuff. And that sort of narrative repeated itself when it came to One Direction. And other similar bands. You can even look at bands like kind of Take That in the early 90s and Boyzone as well. So every kind of decade or so, you kind of get the new wave of boy bands. There'll be a huge kind of fan base of young girls who kind of screaming in mass crowds at their idols, and then the media kind of either mocks them or kind of doesn't treat the fandom maybe as seriously as maybe it is warranted. Now, some of the people in these One Direction crowds, they did seem maybe a little bit unhinged, and I do recommend all of you watch. There's a really good, I think it's a Channel 4 documentary called Crazy About One Direction, which kind of follows various fans of One Direction, kind of the lengths and extremes that they go to simply to kind of catch a glimpse of their idols kind of passing by in a kind of in a dark lit car. Like it's bizarre and sometimes a little bit disconcerting as well, but the media certainly does help propagate particular stereotypes around fandoms, and one of them is the hysterical crowd. So there's a comment about Beatlemania. Said, those who flock around the Beatles, who scream themselves into hysteria, are the least fortunate of their generation. The dull, the idle, the failures, their existence in such large numbers, far from being a cause for ministerial congratulation, is a fearful indictment of our education system, which in 10 years of schooling can scarcely raise them to literacy. So again, just saying that all these young people that are kind of screaming at the mere presence of 4 musicians. It's ridiculous. We've wasted kind of a generation of kind of trying to educate these people because it's made them kind of completely illiterate, kind of a screaming mess. And there's a huge amount of kind of contempt, particularly from the establishment in society at the time, because they just thought, well, this is ridiculous. Why are people so crazy just about 4 kind of people who sing a bit? But there we go, and you do get this sort of returning narrative, kind of the elites within society poo-pooing or downplaying or mocking or chastising the fandoms of that particular day. So aside from the hysterical crowd, you also get the obsessed loner as well, which is another way of portraying fans. Just got 2 examples here, famously in the Alan Partridge episode, which is why I included it. It's not quite kind of Mark Chapman-esque, they've become so obsessed that they're going to shoot somebody, although there are some fans that do end up doing that. But this is just kind of another illustration of how fans are represented in the media. You're either part of a hysterical crowd and mob, or you're kind of a obsessed loner that's maybe potentially dangerous in some way. There's kind of when the media does cover fandoms, they're not just going to cover the normal fan, just oh no, I really like this particular band or this particular kind of actor or actress. No, they're always going to go to the 2 extremes, the hysterical crowd or the obsessed loner, which of course doesn't help the representations of fandoms in general, but that's just because the media tends to go to the extremes in most cases. And then one other important point to consider as well is when the media represents fandoms, is how it represents kind of the fandoms of different genders. So when you're looking at the hysterical crowd, those fandoms, which tend to be kind of the fandoms around boy bands, is the most notable example. Their fans tend to be kind of women, and so the women are kind of perceived and portrayed to be kind of hysterical and kind of over emotional, and it's ridiculous how much emotion they're expressing in regards to just some kind of musicians. However, the media doesn't necessarily do the same thing when it comes to sports fans. And sports fans traditionally are kind of more male, and yet there are kind of hundreds of kind of images of videos of sports fans absolutely kind of losing their minds. They're in tears, they're sobbing, they're inconsolable when their team loses, and yet the media tends to portray that as being, well, that's slightly more rational, that's slightly more understandable when a sports team loses. So the portrayal of that is certainly treated in a different manner to how female fans of a different cultural item in our society are treated. That's just something to be aware of, and something that you may want to potentially look at when it comes to the IJPC module next year. And so, just going towards the end now, just talking about the notion of kind of fandom and identity. So these are just quotes from various academics kind of looking at this concept about how fandoms generate their own identity. So from Shuker, he says that by participating in fandom, fans construct coherent identities for themselves. Sandvoss goes on to say the object of fandom is intrinsically interwoven with our sense of self, with who we are and would like to be and think we are. And then David Hesmontaug, I want to guess at that, says, or talks about the notion of kind of private versus a collective meaning of kind of what sort of identity fandoms kind of wrap themselves up in. And so people do tend to kind of build up their sense of self, and particularly because fandoms can develop at an early age, when people are going through puberty and they're trying to kind of find themselves and understand themselves. And so they will latch on to particular identities. In the 70s and 80s, some young people latched on to kind of punk rock music and generated their identity around that particular subculture image. When it comes to kind of One Direction fans, or it can be particularly kind of other individual artist fans, people try to create their sense of self through the fandoms which they feel themselves to be a part of. And also this notion that kind of they create this sense of identity, and the identity is generated through connecting with other fans. It's not done in isolation, it's done in reference and an acknowledgement to other fans of the same thing. This is a study looking at that kind of fans connecting with one another. It says the Girls Who Love Take That during their first incarnation between 1990 and 1996 formed an innovative, creative and highly productive fan community. And so these young girls and women, they created what was known as friendship books, and essentially they were pen pals with one another. So they'd maybe kind of meet up at a concert or a gig, or it'd be in they'd put their address details in fanzines, and they would send kind of friendship books to one another, kind of their thoughts and comments about who their favourite band member was, and then that would kind of get passed on to the next person, and they'd send it back. It was basically just like a pen pal, essentially. This is a quote from one of the girls who kind of took part in these friendship book transactions. And she said, "We mainly chatted about the band, but with some of my pen pals I used to share all of the joys and sorrows of my daily life as well." And so these kind of fan communities, they weren't just simply discussing only the artist or band that they were interested in. It was also kind of a more communicative social space as well, because this is in the pre-digital era, and so this is where they felt they could communicate with people that they thought they understood, or at least working on the same sort of wavelength, because they had this shared commonality or shared cultural like within society. And then also with relation to kind of fandom and identity, and how people create their identity through their fandom of someone. And this quote from Stevenson says, "The object of fandom can be a cultural resource which can be reinterpreted in the context of their changing life situations." And so David Bowie is a really good example of this. And this is particularly the case with artists who have had long careers over 20, 30 years. So similarly, people like with Bruce Springsteen, is that people kind of chart their life and kind of plan out their identity through that particular artist's discography. And so Bowie's a really good example of how he changed and developed and matured over time in his music. People who were fans of him at the start, their kind of tastes and identity changed over time alongside the music that they were a fan of as well. And so just in summary then, just kind of key points to take away. Fandom is an emotional tie to a person, band, text or object. It's not just simply liking it. You've got to have an emotional investment in that thing, like you would be upset if it disappeared or went away. Second thing is that many fans engage in highly creative activities, and this is often kind of spurred on by their kind of genuine love or kind of emotional expression of the thing they're a fan of. If you're just a casual, oh, I like that type of music, you wouldn't go to the lengths of writing some fan fiction or creating a cover version of somebody's song to be you've got to be a fan in order to really do that. The connection between fans and musicians has been certainly heightened through social media. However, whether this has actually increased the level of intimacy between a fan and the artist, that is up for debate, and that can certainly be looked at on a case-by-case basis when looking at individual artists and their particular fandoms and how they utilise social media. Fourth point, media representations have tended to focus on either historical or hysterical crowd or kind of the obsessed loner, simply because they're kind of the extreme versions of fandom. They're kind of two ends of the spectrum of fandom, and it's very kind of a simple narrative and simple story to tell when you're just going to have to portray someone as a part of a hysterical crowd or an obsessed loner. There's obviously far more complex representations of fandoms, and media are doing slightly better in recent times in representing these fandoms as fandoms become more and more visible. You have journalists who work in the news media who are fans themselves and so know how to treat fandoms maybe in a slightly more responsible way, but for the most part fandoms still aren't being represented in a good way, for want of a better word. Penultimate point, fans gain empowerment from their fandom, a coherent identity. Those fandoms actually do serve some purpose. It's not just fandoms don't exist simply for the sake of existing so that fans of the same thing can talk to one another. They actually serve a purpose for many people within those fandoms. It gives them a sense of identity. It helps them kind of organise and kind of chart their lives through their interaction with those fandoms and those artists. And then finally, music and musicians themselves can offer a stable presence throughout the life of fans and kind of key identity moments in adolescence. I could probably chart my life through kind of various phases of music that I particularly enjoyed. However, there have been kind of a handful of bands that have stayed constant throughout my life, and I can kind of chart my life through that as well. I'm not a massive music fan, but just the notion of fandoms in particular is of interest to me, more so in the kind of cultural, cinematic side of things. But I know that a number of you were particularly interested in kind of going into music journalism or this sort of area in particular, so I just thought I'd do the kind of final bonus lecture of the term on fandoms. So this is going to be the final lecture of the term, but if you have any questions in regards to what I covered in this lecture, or if you've got any questions about the essays, or just anything in regards to the module in general, again, just drop me an email and I'll usually respond fairly quickly, and that's going to be it from me. So stay inside, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.